What if I told you that World War II didn't actually begin in 1939? What if the real starting point was 2 years earlier, in a place most people have never heard of, over a missing soldier that nobody could find? And what if this single moment would eventually lead to the deaths of over 20 million people and reshape the entire world as we know it? This is the story of China's war that the world forgot. A story of courage, betrayal, and decisions so devastating that they still echo through history today. By the end of this, you'll understand why some historians argue that everything we thought we knew about World War II is wrong. Picture this, it's 1937, and China is sitting on a powder keg. The Japanese have been eyeing Chinese territory like a hungry wolf watching a flock of sheep. They've already set up a puppet state called Manchukuo, and tensions are rising by the day. China's leader, Chiang Kai-shek, is playing a dangerous game of chess, trying to avoid a war he knows his country isn't ready for. But here's the thing about avoiding fights, sometimes they find you anyway. Chiang had been focused on what he saw as the real enemy, the communists within his own borders. He figured, why fight the Japanese when he could eliminate his internal threats first? It seemed logical, but the Chinese people were getting fed up with Japanese aggression, and pressure was mounting for him to act. So he did something unexpected. He made a deal with the devil, or at least, with the communists. A temporary truce to focus on the external threat. Little did he know this decision would eventually cost him everything. Now, here's where things get interesting. July 7, 1937, at a place called the Marco Polo Bridge, just outside Beijing. A Japanese soldier goes missing during a routine exercise. Sounds simple enough, right? Wrong. This missing soldier becomes the spark that ignites a war that will consume millions of lives. The Japanese demand to search the nearby Chinese garrison for their missing man. The Chinese refuse. Tempers flare. Someone fires a shot, and suddenly, what started as a bureaucratic disagreement becomes a shooting war. Within days, Japanese reinforcements are pouring into the area like water through a broken dam. But this time, China doesn't back down. Chiang Kai-shek makes a speech that sends chills down your spine. He tells his people that they've reached the limit of endurance, and that from this point forward, they can only sacrifice and fight to the bitter end. Can you imagine standing before your entire nation and essentially declaring that you're all about to walk into hell together? The Chinese people responded with a song that would become legendary, March of the Volunteers. The lyrics are haunting, arise. Those who refuse to be slaves. With our flesh and blood, let's build our new Great Wall. This wasn't just a song, it was a battle cry that would echo across the nation. And decades later? It would become China's national anthem. What happened next was like watching a tsunami in slow motion. The Japanese military machine, with its superior tactics, modern equipment, and air superiority, crashed through Chinese defenses like they were made of paper. In just 6 weeks, nearly 200,000 Japanese troops had occupied massive chunks of northern China, including Beijing itself. But the real horror was yet to come. Shanghai, China's glittering commercial capital, home to millions of people and the heart of the country's economy. This is where both sides decided to dive headfirst into the abyss. Shanghai wasn't just any city. It was like the New York of China, with an international settlement run by 14 different countries, including Japan. The Japanese had become the dominant foreign presence there, with 30,000 civilians and 8,000 Marines. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. Chiang saw an opportunity. If he could bring the fighting to Shanghai, he could divert Japanese forces from the north and, crucially, bring the war under the spotlight of international observers. On August 13, he ordered Chinese forces to attack Japanese ships in Shanghai's harbor. What followed was urban warfare at its most brutal. Picture tanks rolling through city streets, poison gas attacks, and air raids turning the city into a hellscape. 1 million troops would eventually be drawn into this meat grinder. The Chinese fought with desperate courage, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. Their elite German-trained divisions, their best troops, were decimated. In late October, as defeat became inevitable, most Chinese forces began to withdraw. But here's where the story gets truly heroic and heartbreaking at the same time. A single Chinese battalion, just a few hundred men, volunteered to stay behind and hold the Sihang warehouse in the city center. They knew it was a suicide mission. They called themselves the Suicide Battalion, and for 6 precious days, they held out against overwhelming odds, buying time for other units to escape. Their sacrifice played out directly in front of foreign observers in the international settlement, who were protected from the worst of the fighting. The images and reports of Chinese soldiers fighting to the death against impossible odds traveled around the world and turned Western public opinion firmly against Japan. But if you think that was the worst of it, you're not prepared for what comes next. The Japanese forces, now victorious in Shanghai, pursued the retreating Chinese army to Nanking, China's capital. After a desperate 4-day battle, they captured the city on December 13th. A few Westerners inside the city tried to create a safety zone to protect civilians. But most Chinese civilians were left completely defenseless. For 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers went on a rampage that defies description. The looting, torture, rape, and murder were systematic and horrifying. Between 50,000 and 300,000 civilians were killed. Around 30,000 Chinese prisoners of war were executed en masse. Some were decapitated, others buried alive, and many were used for bayonet practice. Bodies piled up in the streets, were burned, and dumped in the Yangtze River. The stench of death hung over the city like a toxic cloud. The man trying to manage the international safety zone was a German businessman and Nazi supporter named John Rabe. Even he, a Nazi, was appalled by the violence and begged Hitler to intervene. Instead, the fall of Nanking convinced the Nazis that Japan was the stronger partner, and Germany cut off all military support to China. The rape of Nanking shocked the world. The USA and League of Nations condemned it, but their words weren't backed up by action. And this wasn't just one horrible incident, atrocities became a standard feature of the Japanese war in China. Systematic rape as a weapon of war, forced prostitution on a massive scale, and the use of chemical and biological weapons that killed thousands more. Now, you might think things couldn't get worse for China. You'd be wrong. As the Japanese army advanced toward Wuhan, China's government made a decision that would haunt the country for generations. They decided to breach the dikes holding back the Yellow River, hoping the floods would stop the Japanese advance. They didn't warn the villages and towns in the flood's path. In June 1938, the waters of the Yellow River surged south and east across the densely populated North China Plain. Entire villages vanished underwater. Farmland that had fed millions was destroyed. 500,000 civilians died, and 5 million became homeless. The loss of farmland would cause famine and suffering for years to come. It was one of the greatest man-made disasters in human history, and it was committed by the Chinese government against its own people. And the cruelest irony? The floods didn't even stop the Japanese. They simply went around the flooded areas and continued their advance. By the time Chinese and Japanese forces clashed near Wuhan, there were nearly 2 million men engaged in battle. Despite heroic resistance, Japanese air power and the widespread use of poison gas proved decisive once again. After 4 months of fighting, Wuhan fell. The Chinese government retreated 500 miles further inland to Chongqing, in western China. The Japanese now controlled China's largest cities and installed a puppet government in Nanking. But their army was exhausted, and the war settled into a deadly stalemate. By 1939, China's situation looked hopeless. Their only major ally was the Soviet Union, which provided crucial supplies and pilots. Soviet aircraft made up most of China's air force. But that summer, as war loomed in Europe, Stalin made a deal with Japan and signed a truce. 2 days later, Soviet troops invaded Poland as allies of Nazi Germany. China was now truly alone. But they kept fighting. Chongqing, the new nationalist capital, endured more than 200 Japanese air raids. In northern China, communist guerrillas carried out large-scale attacks on Japanese forces. The cooperation between nationalists and communists had broken down again, but both groups continued to resist the occupation. China received some supplies through French Indochina, so in 1940, Japan occupied that territory too. This move alarmed the Western powers, whose Southeast Asian colonies were now within range of Japanese forces. The US, Britain, and the Netherlands imposed an oil embargo on Japan, which would cripple its economy and war effort. The Western powers hoped Japan would back down. Instead, Japan decided to gamble everything on a wider war. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The attack that would change everything. The Japanese launched simultaneous attacks on US and British bases across Southeast Asia. In a series of lightning campaigns, they captured Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Japan had awakened a sleeping giant, but for the moment, they seemed unstoppable. China finally had powerful allies, but the situation was still desperate. When the Japanese captured Burma, supplies had to be flown in from India over the Himalayas, a perilous route that American pilots called the Hump. China also got a new American military advisor, General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell. This was not a match made in heaven. Stilwell thought Chiang was a stubborn, ignorant, prejudiced and conceited despot. Chiang found Stilwell arrogant and impossible to work with. They hated each other's guts. More help came in the form of Claire Chennault's famous Flying Tigers, an elite squadron of American volunteers who had remarkable success against the Japanese Air Force. As the war progressed, more U.S. air units arrived, leading to the construction of several American air bases in China. China was now one of the four major Allied powers, alongside the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union. In November 1943, Chiang traveled to Cairo to meet with Churchill and Roosevelt. Chinese resistance was tying down nearly 1 million Japanese soldiers, and the Allies assured Chiang of increased support, though in reality, neither saw China as a priority. But China desperately needed help. What remained of the Chinese economy was collapsing. Rampant inflation, corruption, and a devastated industrial sector were taking their toll. The government struggled to pay its soldiers, who were deserting in growing numbers. And Japan was preparing its largest operation of the war. April 1944. Japan was on the back foot in the Pacific, so they decided to launch a massive offensive in China called Operation Ichigo. The goal was to link northern China with Indochina and destroy U.S. airbases that were being used to bomb Japan. Weakened Chinese forces crumbled under the assault. Several U.S. airbases were captured, and by October, Japan had achieved its objectives. Once again, Chinese forces suffered enormous losses, and Chiang's reputation took another hit. When Stilwell demanded to be put in direct command of all Chinese forces, Chiang had him replaced. But American faith in Chiang was cracking. Some Americans began to contrast nationalist corruption with the apparent success of the Chinese communists, who continued their guerrilla campaign in the north. But Operation Ichigo came too late to save Japan. In spring 1945, the last major Japanese offensive in China was defeated, and Chinese troops went on the counterattack. U.S. strategic bombing of Japan culminated in August 1945 with the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria. Within a week, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The war was over, but the cost was staggering. Between 15 and 20 million Chinese lives were lost. Only the Soviet Union suffered more casualties. Millions more were wounded, displaced, or left destitute. The country needed complete reconstruction. But who would lead that reconstruction was still to be decided. Japan's defeat left a power vacuum in China that both the nationalists and communists rushed to fill. And as the Cold War reached Asia, both sides found backers. The Soviets gave the communists Manchuria and captured Japanese weapons, while the US and Britain flew nationalist forces into northern and eastern China. In an effort to prevent civil war, Chiang and communist leader Mao Zedong met for US-sponsored talks. The agreement they reached lasted about as long as a snowball in a furnace. As Chiang told his aides, the sky cannot have two suns. In 1946, civil war erupted. Chiang launched an assault on communist-held northern China with his elite US-trained divisions. The nationalists made early gains, taking key cities and even the communists' wartime base. But the communists had learned from 8 years of fighting the Japanese. They avoided major battles, stuck to guerrilla tactics, and in rural areas, their program of land reform attracted thousands of peasants to their cause. Meanwhile, the nationalists were developing a reputation for incompetent and corrupt government. Chinese industry and trade had been devastated by war, but economic mismanagement made things worse, causing hyperinflation. Despite heavy backing from the US, the nationalists were rapidly losing support in both cities and rural areas. In 1947, Communist General Lin Biao reorganized communist forces into the People's Liberation Army, nearly 1 million strong. Mao decided it was time to abandon guerrilla tactics and take on the nationalists in open warfare. In a string of successful counteroffensives, the communists captured territory, weapons, and supplies, conscripting deserters and prisoners into their ranks. The tide of war was shifting dramatically. September 1948 marked the beginning of the end. The People's Liberation Army launched 3 major offensives. In the first, Lin Biao swept the nationalists out of Manchuria. The nationalists lost more than 400,000 men, with only 150,000 able to escape south. The following month, 2 simultaneous campaigns led to the capture of key cities. It was a disastrous winter for the nationalists, who suffered another 500,000 casualties and lost most of their best equipment. In just 4 months, the communists had won 3 major victories and driven their enemies from northern China. In the southern cities, there was chaos and lawlessness as nationalist rule collapsed. The communist advance continued through the spring. In April, they took Nanking, and the following month, Shanghai, China's largest city, fell. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood before a packed Tiananmen Square in Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. That winter, the last nationalist strongholds fell. It's estimated that more than 2 million soldiers were killed or wounded in 4 years of civil war, with perhaps another 5 million civilians dying from fighting, famine, and disease. Chiang Kai-shek, along with 2 million nationalist troops and refugees, retreated to Taiwan, one of the last territories under nationalist control. He would never return to mainland China. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party were triumphant. Now the work would begin to build a new China from the wreckage of invasion and civil war. So why does this matter today? This forgotten war didn't just reshape China, it changed the entire global balance of power. The Chinese Civil War determined that the world's most populous country would become communist, setting the stage for the Cold War dynamics that would define the next half-century. The decisions made during these brutal years, from the Marco Polo Bridge to the retreat to Taiwan, still influence international relations today. The division between mainland China and Taiwan, the rise of communist China as a global superpower, the complex relationships between China, Russia, and the United States, all of it traces back to this period that most people know nothing about. And perhaps most importantly, this story shows us how quickly the world can change. In just 12 years, China went from a divided, war-torn country to a unified communist state. It reminds us that history isn't just something that happened in the past, it's something that's always happening, always reshaping our world in ways we might not fully understand until years later. The next time someone tells you World War II started in 1939, you'll know better. You'll know that for millions of Chinese people, the war started 2 years earlier with a missing Japanese soldier and a few shots fired at a bridge. And you'll understand that sometimes, the most important events in history are the ones that don't make it into the textbooks. If this story opened your eyes to a part of history you never knew existed, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what surprised you most. And if you want more deep dives into the forgotten stories that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe because trust me, we're just getting started. History is full of incredible stories that deserve to be told, and I'm here to tell them.